Yes, ma'am, start.
Good afternoon, dear students. I welcome you all in the live classes of GOVT program run by Commissionerate College Education. I am Mrs. ALKA PANWAR, Assistant Professor in English from Government Girls College, AJMER. Today, I am going to deal with the topic, critical appreciation of poetry. This topic is of relevance for all the classes, but today I am dealing especially with the beginners. So, what do you mean by critical appreciation of a poem? Let me tell you that critical appreciation is not just a summary of the poem. Summary is just a part of the critical appreciation. Critical appreciation is something deep. It means to critically analyze a poem, to critically appreciate a poem, to find out the hidden meanings, to find out what is written between the lines. So whenever we critically appreciate a poem, first we should prepare ourselves. And what is that preparation? You should read and reread and reread a poem. Until and unless you have the textual knowledge of the poem, you will not be able to critically appreciate a poem properly. So reading the text is must. And whenever we start with the critical appreciation of a poem, it is important for us to know that there are two basic levels on which we base our critical appreciation. And what are those basic levels? We critically appreciate thematically and stylistically. What do I mean by thematic appreciation of a poem? Thematic appreciation is related to the theme. It deals with the question of what is written, W-H-A-T. Theme is the question. Thematic means that you have to base your focus on what is written, and stylistic means how it is written. So there are basically two questions to deal with: what is written and how it is written. So thematic and stylistic. Now, for your convenience, I have divided my lecture in points. So first of all, what do? You introduce the poet you are dealing with. So when you introduce a poet, what are the points you should include? First of all, you write the name of the poet, the era in which he wrote. Era means age, whether he wrote in the Elizabethan age or whether he belongs to the Romantic age or Victorian age. And if the poet has a title, for example, for Wordsworth, we say that he is called the High Priest of Nature. And Shakespeare is known as the Bard of Avon. Spenser is conferred with the title of the poet's poet. So, pen name. If he has a pen name, you have to mention it. Then, major works of the poet. You have to include in your answer certain major works of the poet. And if he is conferred with poet laureateship, you can include this also in your answer. Then the next point is introduction of the poem. You have to shortly introduce the poem. And how you have to do it? You have to mention the anthology or the collection from which the poem is taken. Then the date of publication, etc. Any other significant information about the poem you can include in this point. Then comes the genesis of the poem. Genesis means the origin of the poem. If there was a special occasion or reason for writing of the poem by the poet, you have to mention it. For example, when Milton wrote on his 23rd birthday, he had completed 23 years of his age. And when William Cooper wrote on the receipt of my mother's picture. So what was the occasion? He got his mother's picture as a gift from his cousin. So that became the reason for writing. of the poem. So that is the genesis of the poem. This point is not necessarily applicable to all the poems, because all the poems do not have specific origins. So please do write with wherever it is applicable. And there may be reasons like birthday, death, parting. So in your third year, you have last ride together. So what is the reason and what is the occasion, what is the origin of the poem? That the lovers are parting. They are meeting for the last time. So this is the genesis of the poem. Then comes the theme of the poem. In the theme, you have to include the central idea, the basic thought of the poem. For example, Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds deals with the characteristics of true love. Ice and Fire deals with the complaint of the lover that his beloved is cold-hearted. So whatever is the basic idea, the central idea, basic thought of the poem, you have to include. So this point also comprises of 3 to 4 sentences. Then comes the mood of the poet, the mood or the tone of the poet, whether the poet is in a sad mood, whether he is in a happy or a gay mood, thoughtful and reflective mood, as when Shakespeare wrote, went to the sessions, contemplative, whether he is contemplating on anything, complaining mood. The example of complaining mood is Ice and Fire and Go and Catch a Falling Star. So whatever is the occasion, we will write. Then comes the summary of the poem. Summary, I'm sorry for the spelling mistake. This point is the longest point of the answer. In the summary, you have to paraphrase the meaning of the poem in your own words. Remember, you have to write the meaning of the poem in your own words. You have to show your originality. So stanza by stanza, you have to explain your understanding of the text. After you have attempted the summary of the poem, you will write the type or the genre of the poem. There are many types of poetry: sonnet, comprising of 14 lines, ode, which is an address, lyric, which is a poem with musical qualities, ballad, elegy, which is a death song, dramatic monologue, whether it is a blank verse, free verse. So you have to categorize the poem. So till point number 5, we were dealing with thematic appreciation. Now we are dealing with the stylistic appreciation of any poem, because now we are dealing with how the poem is written. So how means whether it is written in the form of a sonnet or whether it is written in the form of an ode or lyrics. So you have to mention the genre of the poem. Now, when you write the type of the poem, with it is attached the rhyme scheme. So it depends on the type of poem. And if it is a Shakespearean sonnet, the rhyme scheme would be ABAB, CD, EF, and GG. If it is a Miltonic sonnet, then ABBA, CDE, or CDE. Then a poem may have a regular rhyme scheme or may not have. So if it doesn't contain any regular rhyme scheme, then we will mention that it has an irregular rhyme scheme, or it may not contain a rhyme scheme at all. So that may be the case with blank verse and free verse, which do not have any regular rhyme scheme. So in this point of rhyme scheme, we will deal indirectly with the type of the poem, because rhyme scheme is related to the type of the poem. And then we can also mention whether it has a regular rhyme scheme or irregular rhyme scheme, whether if it is a blank verse, then we will mention that. And the same is the case with free verse, which does not contain any rhyme scheme. Literary features or figures of speech. This point may also be called as literary beauties. This is where the beauty of the poem is contained. This is the most important point included in the stylistic appreciation of a poem. A poem is made beautiful by its literary features, by the figures of speech employed by the poet. So you have to literally dissect a poem. As the science student used to do dissection of a frog, and they used to make out the heart and the liver and the lungs, and the more organs they used to make out, the more marks they got. In the same way, as I told you in the at the very outset, that you have to read and reread and reread. Believe me, each time you read a poem, you will develop a new perspective towards a poem. You will find out a new meaning. Even if you have read a poem 10 years ago and you reread it again because you have grown up now, so your perspective, your way of looking at things has grown up. So you will find a difference between your perspective 10 years ago and today's perspective. So I suggest that you should read and reread a poem for a number of times. So you will find out that there may be a simile where two things are compared with the help of like and as, and there may be a direct comparison with the help of a metaphor. Then there may be an example of alliteration, which is the repetition of similar consonant sounds. The poem may contain hyperbole. For example, the poem, Go and Catch a Falling Star. The whole poem is filled with hyperboles. It is highly hyperbolic poem, which says that there can be no woman who is beautiful as well as loyal. The first stanza of the poem contains a hyperbole in each and every line. Go and catch a falling star. Get me, child, with a mandrake root. Tell me where all past years are, and who cleft the devil's foot. So each and every line. But he says that all the things are possible, but it is impossible to find a woman who is beautiful and loyal. So this is an example of hyperbole. Then we have conceit. Conceit is also a comparison, but it is a far-fetched comparison, unusual, uncommon, non-traditional comparison. Then the poem may have paradoxes. For example, the poem by Ice and Fire, the poem Ice and Fire by Edmund Spenser contains a lot of paradoxes. And the paradox is that ice does not melt by coming in contact with fire. And fire is not getting extinguished while coming in contact with ice. So this is the greatest paradox of the poem, Ice and Fire. Then there may be onomatopoeia. What is onomatopoeia? It is the correlation of sound and words. For example, hiss. When we say hiss, the actual sound of the snake comes out. Chirp, splash. These may be the words in the poem. Then there may be oxymorons, pleasing pains, two opposite words juxtaposed with each other. Then there may be antithesis, transferred epithet, homeward plods his weary way. So the way is not weary, but the person, the farmer, is weary. Then there may be personification. So whatever may be the case, these are just a few examples of literary features or figures of speech. And each time you read the poem, you will find more and more meaning and more literary features, and you have to mention them in your answer. Then comes diction. Now, what do you understand by this word diction? You all have consulted dictionaries. So dictionary is a word framed from the word diction. So what is contained in a dictionary? Words and words. So diction means simply words and terms. So diction, some words or terms from particular fields. If we find that the poet has used legal diction, then you have to mention it. Now, what do you mean by legal diction? When we read a poem, for example, went to the sessions by William Shakespeare, when we read this poem, we find certain words which are used in the language of law, in the language of court. For example, summon, sessions, tax, grievances. So we will say that this poem contains legal diction. And we find agricultural diction also. For example, in the Solitary Reaper, we find words which are used in agriculture, in the field of agriculture. For example, field, crop, cutting, binding, sickle. We may have astrological words. We may find astrological words in the poem. So we will mention that this poem contains astrological diction. Then there may be historical diction used in the poem. So whatever is the case, you have to mention it. Then a poem may contain archaic or old English words like thou, thee, thy, goeth, showeth, groweth. So we will say that the poet has used old English words or archaic words. And this is especially the case with Spenser and Shakespeare. They use archaic words. Then in diction, you may include the syllables also, the mention of syllables. Now, what's a syllable? Syllable is the unit of speech. The words may be monosyllabic or polysyllabic. Now, what do you mean by monosyllabic words? Monosyllabic words contain just one syllable. The position of our tongue does not change while speaking the monosyllabic word. For example, I, you, we, go, come, sit. These are the monosyllabic words. And polysyllabic words, what do you mean by polysyllabic words? The words which contain more than one syllable, 2 or 3 or 4. For example, college. College contains 2 syllables, call and age. Then comparison and contrast. When we are dealing with the critical appreciation of the poem, we compare the poem with the poem, another poem by the same poet, or with another poem by another poet. Or if the whole poem is not comparable, we can compare a certain thought or certain idea of that poem with another poem. For example, Ice and Fire by Edmund Spenser can be compared with Go and Catch a Falling Star by John Donne. Now, what is the basis of comparison? That both these poems are complaints. And both these poems are complaints against their beloved. And what is the point of contrast? What do you mean by contrast? First of all, contrast means something in opposition. Now, these two poems contain the element of contrast also, though they are both complaints against the beloveds. But what is the basis of contrast? That Ice and Fire is a soft complaint. Ice and Fire is a playful complaint against his beloved. He is just playfully complaining. It is not a serious complaint. But in the poem Go and Catch a Falling Star by John Donne, it is a serious and pungent complaint. It is so serious that he goes to the level of generalizing that there can be no woman who is beautiful as well as loyal. So I hope you understood the point of comparison and contrast, which is the comparison and contrast in ideas. It can be regarding language, it can be regarding the central theme of the poems with other poems or within the poem. Now, what is the point when we say that there can be comparison or contrast within the poem? Now, let us take the poem Went to the Sessions. When we read the 3 quatrains of the poem, we think that this is a sad poem and the poet is in a complaining mood. and he has a lots of complaints against his life, that he wanted to have a lot of things but he could not have. And he's complaining about a lot of friends who have died, who have departed. And he is complaining about a lot of vanished sights from his life. But when we reach the final couplet, there is a contrast of his feeling, there's a contrast of his thought, contrast of mood. When he says, but if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. So there is a contrast of feeling, contrast of mood within the poem itself. In the same way, when we read On His Blindness by Milton, we see that in the octave, he is complaining about his blindness. He's complaining to God that he has been made blind and the gift of poetic art is lying waste with him. But when we reach the sestet, he is at peace with himself. He consoles himself that whatever God is doing, he is doing his best. Then we come to imagery. We have to ponder over the images the poet has created in the poem. Very carefully, you have to study and make out the imagery and include in your answer. Then, if there are any references, if the poet has made a biblical reference, biblical allusion. What do you mean by allusion? Allusion means references. If he has alluded to the Bible, if he has referred to the Bible, we will mention it in our answer. And if he has referred to some mythology, Indian mythology, or any incident of the Greek mythology, you have to make out of that reference and include in your answer. Then the critic's point of view. This is very, very important point in the whole critical appreciation, that you have to insert critical comments of any critic or any other poet on the theme, language, or any other speciality of the poem. You will find many critical comments on the poem or on the poet, and it would be good for you if you include critic's point of view in your answer. Here, I would like to add one more thing, that in your whole answer, you have to insert quotable quotes from the text. At 2 to 3 points, you can insert 1 or 2 lines from the text that will show the examiner that you have the textual knowledge and you know the relevance of the inserted line in relation to your answer. And if there is any other speciality of the poem, each and every poem is different from each other. So you have to mention that speciality. For example, Ice and Fire is filled with paradoxes. It is filled with binaries. What do you mean by binaries? Binaries means opposites. Ice and fire, cold and hot, love and hatred. So these are the binaries. So each and every poem contains a speciality which is different, which makes it different from another poem. So it is your vigilance that how much deep you can delve into the poem and make out its speciality. Then in the end, you can add your original comments on the language, on the theme, and the emotional appeal of the poem. How do you like the poem? Whether you liked the language of the poem, or the theme, or the figures of speech that he has employed to make his poem beautiful, or you liked the emotional appeal of the poem, or you liked all these points, the language, theme, and emotional appeal of the poem. Then, whenever you are dealing with the critical appreciation of a poem, remember that these are not the only points to be included. These are just the basic points to be dealt with. You can have more and more points according to your own thinking, according to your own perspective. These are just the basic points, because as I told you that each and every poem is different from another poems. So it depends on you to make out what makes it different from another poem, to make out more and more points on imagery, on references, on diction, on language, and literary beauties. Then, so let us do a quick revision. So whenever we are dealing with a critical appreciation of a poem, we write a small introduction of the poet, which includes the name, era, title, pen name, major works. And then another point is introduction of the poem. It is also a small introduction of the poem in which you have to include the anthology from which the poem has been taken, or the collection. For example, Ice and Fire has been taken from Amority. You can also include the date of publication. Then the genesis of the poem, as I told you, it means the origin or the occasion, the reason or the inspiration which inspired the poet to write the poem. Then the theme of the poem includes the central idea, the basic theme of the poem. Then the mood of the poet, there are nth number of moods of the poet, and within a poem also, a poet can change his mood, as I gave you the example of On His Blindness by John Milton, that his mood switches over from complaining to consolation. Then the summary of the poem, this is the longest part of the critical appreciation, and I would also like to add that here I have bifurcated the points for your understanding. You can omit the 1, 2, 3, you can omit the points, and you can include, you can make your answer all inclusive of all these points to make it more mature. And then the type or genre of the poem, you have to mention the type of the poem the poet has written, and I have already told you the basic types of the poem. Then the rhyme scheme is related to the type of the poem. Then the literary features, which is the most important point in critical appreciation. And these are just a few examples. A poem may contain figures of speech which are not included here. It depends on you to read and reread the poem with different perspectives, with a perspective of meaning, with a perspective of language, with a perspective of literary features, and each and every time you read the poem, you will come out with something new. Then comes the diction. As I told you, that diction means words. What type of words he has used in his poem? The words containing terms from a particular field. For example, legal, agricultural, astrological, historical, and he may use Old English words, which are called archaic words. Then comes the monosyllabic or polysyllabic words. Then comparison and contrast of the ideal language central theme of the poem with other poems, or within the poem also there can be a comparison and contrast. Then comes the imagery and references. References is very significant. As I told you that you include points where you find that poet has alluded to, or the poet has referred to the Bible, or referred to the Indian mythology, or referred to something very significant. Point of view, which is a very, very important point to be included. Here you have to include a critic's comment, and you are including the exact words by the critic. You have to put them in inverted comma, otherwise you can write according to and dash dash dash. Then comes point of view in which you will give your own feeling towards the poem. How do you feel after reading the poem, and what were your thoughts when you read the poem? Language, theme, and feeling of the poem. So thank you for watching. Thank you.